history, Mr. Hardi. He will talk to us on the tragic history of Africa from civilization to annihilism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MC, for the opportunity. I also want to tell a story of a tragic Africa. And that story, I think, fits well into what has been discussed so far. So I will not even look at the presentation outline because of time. But I want to see what happened to Africans if we created a glorious civilization that the world has ever seen. What happened to us? Where from this tragedy of Africa? And so I want to start with a look at a story of Black Africa, which is the cradle of civilization and architect of the first globalized world. For most of us, we think that today's globalized world that we call globalization was the first in the history of the world. That is not true. There was the first globalized world that was built by our ancestors, starting from Egypto-Nubia. That was the cradle of human civilization. So we built the first globalized world, a world that was interconnected throughout the world, just like it is interconnected today. And so we built almost everything. And in the writings of even white people, that the black man is the origin of anything that has ever existed. And then the black world was comprising present-day Africa, Asia, Middle, Far East, Central Asia. We settled Australia, Europe, South and Central America before the white man was ever anything. We had settled in Europe, present-day Europe that the white man calls his homeland. We had settled in Europe before the white man came. And so we had built this global world that was thriving. For some say the Egypto-Nubian civilization lasted for 18,000 years. We only have the white man, Indo-European barbarism, that is just about 500 years, but we are suffocating. Imagine a civilization that could last for 18,000 years. And so we had black empires that were in Mesopotamia, we had Persia, we had Karasu, Olmec and Maya, Azteca, what have you, that was spread all over the world before the white man became anything. And then the tragedy happened. And the first of the tragedy was that when our ancestors crossed the Mediterranean and they settled in the land of Canaan or Persia or Mesopotamia, they had built thriving civilizations there. And then when glaciation happened in what is called the Caucasus Mountains, that's where the white man originally came from. It's called the Caucasus Mountains. So glaciation, that is the rising of the sea levels through the melting of ice. That happened in prehistoric times. So whatever we are experiencing today as climate change is nothing new. It's just a repetition of things that have happened before. So glaciation means that the sea levels in the mountains were rising, meaning that the white man could not live in the caves in the mountains. So they were forced out. So they had this exodus. Just like when poverty drove them from Europe and they went to Americas and Australias and conquered them. It's the same thing. So glaciation was the first that drove the white man out of his caves in the mountains. And so they came out to meet our ancestors settled in Mesopotamia, so Babylonia, Assyria, and what have you. And then our ancestors accepted them willingly without any hesitation. Because if people are looking for ways to survive, you integrate them. So they accepted these Indo-Europeans from the Caucasus Mountains. So when they are called Caucasians, it is because of where they came from, the Caucasus. And that is the mountain. So when they came up, our ancestors in Mesopotamia accepted them, integrated them into their society, and taught them the art of civilization. So as more and more of them come into integration, with the mindset of the white man, they eventually took over that society and turned against us. So they took over the society, enslaved our ancestors. And because of that, some of the ancestors decided that, okay, let's do Sankofa, just like we are saying. They had to trace their route back to where they came from, Egypt to Nubia. So by coming back, they created a trail for the white man to actually know that Egypt and Nubia was actually the home of the African civilization. And so from that onwards, the white man started the first epoch of conquest began. So from that they know where our civilization originated from. Now, sustained attacks, according to Sheikh Anta Diop and other historians, that they began to attack. And as Prof. Obadali mentioned, each time they came, we were able to push them back. But as we continued to push them back, there was a time they became victorious. And so, according to Prof. Eric Klein, maybe other historians would put it at different times. In 1177, the first world order of the black man collapsed because the white man succeeded in what? Conquering Egypto-Nubian civilization that our ancestors had built for years. And so that was the first encounter. So they came out, we willingly accepted them, introduced them to the heart of civilization. They took the knowledge, turned over us, and then it started a series of what? Conquests that was to last until today. And so after that encounter, the next was the pre-colonial encounters that Africa had with, especially mostly the Indo-European. So we had an encounter with the Hyksos. I think his name was mentioned earlier. We had an encounter with the Greco-Macedonians. We had an encounter with the Romans. The Arabs came, and then the Ottomans, and then Napoleon was the last. So Egypt and Nubia had been under continuous attack from all these groups of people over the period. And then when the Roman Empire collapsed, this is just to show the resilience of the African. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the African rebirth took place. And within a short period from the 5th century to the, let's say the 16th century, we rebuilt empires. We built the great empires of Mali, the Songhai, and the Ghana Empire. And this just to demonstrate that when the African is left alone, we will do something. Then what happens? Then there came European Renaissance. And that European Renaissance that took place was as a result of the African ingenuity. Our ancestors called the Moors. They took the light of knowledge from Africa and they planted it in Europe. They built the first university in the history of Europe called University of Salamanca. And that university was built in Spain. And that university was the origin or the roots of European Renaissance. And when the Europeans began to learn again and to become civilized again, what did they do? They headed back onto the African continent as what? Exploiters and explorers. And so they came for our labor in the form of slavery. They came for our resources. And they laid the foundation for the perpetual colonization of the black continent. And so, after slavery was followed by colonization. So slavery was just to come and take whatever they wanted out of the continent. But colonization was to physically own the continent, to control it physically. So they set up boundaries. They sat in Berlin in 1884 and divided Africa among themselves. So they could come in and divide this whole, if it was a people. They would divide this whole into Ghana and Togo. And over time, the people here would start to fight the people over there because artificial boundaries had been created. So that was the colonization came to physically control Africa. And so they introduced European education, religion, governance, and what have you, as a means by which they can what? Control us. And so people who were educated, Africans who were taken to Europe and America and wherever to be educated began to get alienated from their history, their identity, and their values. I still remember in my religion class that I was told Joseph Mbiti, who was one of the early African elites to be sent to Europe, when he came back, he said his mother tongue, which was Fanti, could no longer express his acquired faith of Christianity. So Fanti was no longer good enough to express his faith of what? Christianity. So that is how they got us alienated from our cultures and ideas and values. And that's where we are today. And then we moved through what we call colonialism, neo-colonialism. And Nkrumah thought neo-colonialism was the last stage of imperialism. But is it really? And so neo-colonialism was a shift from physical to mental control. Because physically controlling us is just going to be very difficult. So they had to find ways to control our minds. And once you control the mind, then you don't have to worry about the individual anymore. So they create these systems of perpetual dependency, where they introduce aid, loans, grants, donations, and what have you. And then they also created a global narcissistic monetary systems, capitalism, so that we are continually dependent on what is called a global capitalist system. But that does nothing but to control us. And then I am asking a question, are we moving beyond neo-colonialism to what is called annihilism, which is a complete obliteration of the African sense of self, identity, values, and self-worth, to the point that a definition of the African becomes blurred, meaningless, and even uninteresting. For some of us who are conscious, the word Africa means something, or African means something to us. But for most of the youth today, it doesn't. It's so meaningless to say, I'm an African. And so we are moving beyond neo-colonialism to what is called annihilism, so that the sense of idea of identity of the African has to even be pushed out of our minds. And that is a tragedy. And so they introduced technology. Today our youth are busy on social media. Busy on social media, digital media, entertainment, and what have you. There's nothing that helps us to identify who we are. We are embedded into Western technology to the point that we don't even know that we are distinct from anybody else who is creating this technology. And so they create poverty. There's artificial creation of poverty in Africa. Because when people are suffering, they don't have time to think about liberating themselves. So when the slaves in America were not allowed to own property, it was because if you own property, you can have the luxury of time to actually think of adding value or even expressing the value that you have within you. So if African youth are jobless and struggling to survive, they are going to even end up using drugs. So how can they think about themselves as distinct people who deserve some kind of respect in the scheme of things in the world? And so why did that happen to us? Why did the tragedy happen to us? And I'm thinking that the African is the only race or group of people in the world that lacks common interest. We don't have anything called a black interest. Not among Africans in the African homeland, and not among Africans in the diaspora. And that's our greatest weakness. And then we have the Ubuntu philosophy. We think that resources are abundant, so there's no need to fight over anything. And the Ubuntu means I am because you are. So it means we think in collective terms. So once you think in collective terms, you take anybody else as part of you. So when the white man comes with scheming ideas, you just take him as part of you. And then he comes in and sows the seeds that's going to uproot you. And our dangerous hospitality. Each time the white man comes pretending to be in need, we accept them without question. And because we're born into abundance, when resources are scarce, you have to fight for, you are always conscious of yourself, your survival. But if you are born into abundance, it's difficult for you to think that there's someday things will become scarce and you have to struggle for it. So you accept everybody, you share with anybody that comes. And that's part of our problems. And so I think that I want to move here because I think I'm going to go beyond time. And so, who should we blame for our state? Is it the slave buyer or the slave raider? Is it the one who came with the money and said, go and raid the slaves, I'll pay you this money? Or if you don't raid them, I will raid you. Should we blame we, the Africans who sold ourselves, or should we blame those who came looking to buy the slaves? And should we blame bad leadership in Africa, or should we blame the external forces that are controlling our leaders? And should we blame the African who betrays his fellow African, or should we blame those who incentivize the African to betray his brothers? These are questions I'm asking, I don't have the answers. So what can we do? I see the portrait of an Africa as something that is bleak. Joblessness and unemployment is really rising. And we provide education, but that education has no meaning. We go through a bad production process. Students enter first year university and they end up fourth year with a certificate, but there's no value in that certificate because they cannot produce anything. Or they don't even know anything about themselves. African leadership and vision is directed from outside the continent, not from within. Even the ideas of African Union, when Nkrumah mooted the idea of Organization of African Unity, it was homegrown. But because of Nkrumah, that homegrown African unity had to be shifted to what is called AU, directed from outside. The after that we are pursuing is not an African idea. And do you know that Israel is a member of the African Union? How many of us know that? Israel as a member of the African Union, how many of us knew that? How many of us knew in 2013 that Israel applied to become a member, and Israel has been an observer member for African Union since 1975. But when Turkey applied to join EU, the whole world had to know. Why is it that when Israel applied to join African Union, no African knew about it? And then Africa is bedeviled with economic hardship. There are just other forms of puppets who are in disguise. What about the works of Lumumba? Does that promote African growth? What about Arikana? What about the African Union, the AFTA, the ECOWAS, and what have you? So is Africa really rising? Thank you.